small number of questions, of queries. And these could be as simple as, what kind of a future would you like to see for your grandchildren? Very simple. But the impact over time was to increase the flow of novel ideas and ways forward, and to reinforce in delegates' minds the notion that they had the potential of working together to identify approaches to one of the greatest challenges of our time, rather than squaring off through repeated statements of national positions. So in our experience, strategies that have been effective in values-based work include listening, reaching out, making connections to real people's lives, and creating safe spaces for new ideas to emerge. To conclude then, our work over many decades at the United Nations suggests that first, values are a legitimate and effective entry point for policy works, and I would say that's where change starts. That progress is often made through engaging with the inconsistencies in the values that people hold, and that fostering values-based change requires us to develop different strategies that, at least for us, include listening, reaching out, making connections to real people's lives, and creating safe spaces for new ideas to emerge. So then, to finish, I'd like to read you one more quote from the writings of Duncan Wood, one of the early directors of our sister office in Geneva, on the role of accompanying policymakers at the UN in a way that is rooted in values, yet takes into account the complexity and constraints on those making the decisions. I quote, "Since we are not in a position of power, the dilemmas are not ours to solve, the choices not ours to make. From time to time, we may be brought close to those who do have to find the solutions and make the choices. And on such occasions, it may or may not be given to us to make suggestions which promote the better of two choices or solutions. But it is more important that we express our conviction that decisions affecting the lives of multitudes cannot be dictated by worldly expedients, but must be taken, as we would express it, under concern. We must not suppose that those in authority are unaware of this, but we must recognize that their liberty of action is often circumscribed by the nature of their office. The powerful are not necessarily free. We who are freer than they are to follow what we believe to be right may at times be called upon to stand beside them as they seek for light on the road to peace." Thank you. So I believe we may have some time for questions. Yes, so please, the floor is open. Yes.
Andrew, how do you expose the people that you're talking to, other than bringing somebody right there, to what the impact is of what they're doing, they're deciding at that moment? Photography and video and all the media seems like one possibility, but I don't know what is that.
Yeah, I think it's all of the above. I mean, whatever you can do to make a direct connection. Certainly, the problem often is time. So yes, you can do the video things, but to get someone to come to a sitting of an hour and a half, movie or documentary or something can be really hard. Whereas somehow it's more of a draw very often to bring someone. I mean, as we have, in fact, the last 2 days, we've had someone from Burundi with us and actually meeting with the Secretary General Envoy's office for the Great Lakes and with a variety of other diplomats and others, because then particularly if you've worked with that person and helped them work through how to express that experience. Because if you're taking someone who's doing community-level work in Central Africa, take them into the middle of New York, into a conference room with policymakers, and expect them to be able to talk to one another, it doesn't happen automatically, right? You really have to work almost with both sides to help to bring the perspectives together. I think also finding ways to, even if there's anything where you can make a connection with something in the person themselves. That link, and of course, we're talking about people from many, many places around the world who actually quite often will have somewhere in their experience, and maybe their personal experience, something where you can make that sort of connection. So I think it's almost whatever tool you can find that will do it. And but sometimes, yes, the visual can be extremely important, and we've done photo exhibits of different sorts in Quaker House, and shorter videos. Sometimes, whatever you can do. It's still a very sort of staid environment, a little bit, the UN. People have not switched so much onto social media in some ways as the rest of us may have done. But I think those tools are actually starting to happen as well, and I think we will see some transformations of that. The other part of it, of course, where social media particularly can be very useful, is then building external social movements to what people like us are doing inside. So matching inside strategies and outside strategies are really important. And a number of times we've worked with partners outside, so you may get people demonstrating or doing whatever it is that needs to be done to really, to raise some of the pressure from the outside. Well, we can be working on the inside as well in tandem. So I'm not saying one strategy is better than the other at all. At best, they're complementary, right? And it's in those sorts of areas and in the social movements and the organizing side of things where really the digital and the video and the social media tools can be hugely important. Please.
Your office has been in existence for close to 70 years. What are some of the successes that you've had over those 70 years? I'm sure over those 70 years there are things that your office has felt really good about. What are some of those things?
Just a couple in sort of different areas. One of them was child soldiers. So it's an issue that we're now more familiar with, but 25 years ago, the whole concept, the category of thinking and action that encompasses had not been thought about. And it was something that our offices and some others, some psychologists and therapists and others literally went into the field, documented a lot of these cases of 8 to 12-year-old boys and girls being forced to act as soldiers, being act, of course, in different, being act of people's wives for soldiers and so on, both in some cases in formal armies, but also particularly in rebel groups, and the trauma involved in that is unimaginable. And so that was one particular issue which we were proud of bringing to the table. I think another one, our Geneva office has done a long-term work around criminal justice issues, and particularly on the rights of women prisoners. Now, there are more men than women in prisons all over the world, but as happens in these cases, so many of the systems are actually designed for the men rather than the women. So we have these horrendous cases of people giving birth in shackles and all of this kind of stuff. So the needs of women in prison, first of all, and then the needs of the children of prisoners. And they've been also picking up work recently on the effects on the children of prisoners sentenced to death. And so there is this part of this, some of the work is connected with sort of responses to immediate big things happening, or outbreaks of violence, whatever it is. Some of it is this longer-term, consistent sort of chipping away at issues, because if the standards get set at the UN, then the next country come along to write their constitution or whatever, goes to those standards to look, and so automatically it clicks into place. So that's a couple of examples. Please. So it's a really interesting and critical question, and there are several elements of answer, I think. One is it's important that there are frameworks, at least, which are set out and have broad legitimacy internationally, which set out basic principles of economic justice. Implementation is a different thing, and we'll get onto it, but at least so that the statements of principle should be there. I mean, if we think about it, I mean, I referred to the Declaration of Independence. That was rather a long time ago, and we're still working on it, right? So the UN Charter was 1945. So we've got a little more time, perhaps, on the way these seem to work. But something like this new framework of the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development has actually broken new ground. So, for example, there's a big focus on inequalities. And inequalities, both economic and political, but interestingly, not just inequalities of opportunity, but also inequalities of outcome, which is really, and which is a big debate, right? And it's very interesting then to get, at least in those documents, those kinds of things starting to appear. Now, there are at a global level, there are questions that relate to economic justice. We obviously are still feeling the effects of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, which for most of the developing world, they perceived as an irresponsible breakdown of the world financial system by powers that should know better. And it's actually not a bad analysis when you go back and look at it. And there are also still within the global trade rules and things like this, it's still very hard for a developing country to get ahead, because by all sorts of protective standards and other things, there are ways in which the rich country keep products from the developing countries out and away from them. There are even issues at that level on financial flows. So there was an extraordinary report last year, the Mbeki report on financial flows in Africa, which suggested that actually Africa is a net contributor to the global economy if it wasn't for the $50 billion, plus or minus, that gets illicitly moved out of the economy, particularly by transfer pricing from Western corporations. So they'll make sure that none of their profits appear in Africa where it might get taxed, and they'll run it through a couple of tax havens in the middle, and gosh, it never seems to get taxed at all. So there's all of these, and these are big pieces that take a long time to move around. The good things that we have, at least some moves, for example, in the voting at the World Bank and the IMF, which is moving a little bit away from the people who were just dominating the world in the 1940s, which it's all about. Now, then you've got the bottom up. And then you've got what can be done actually in countries all around the world, both just where the poorest countries are, but then also within countries. And we have countries like Angola, right? So if you look at purely at GDP, looks like they're doing great, and they've got oil. The problem is that it's one of the most unequal places on earth, and none of that money actually trickles down to 95% of the population. So it's both about doing things at a global level and trying to find ways to encourage things to be done differently within countries as well. At least with the 2030 Agenda, we have a framework where a lot of that stuff is named. Implementation requires both money at a time when the world kind of doesn't have any, and there are one or two other things out there like climate change and so on. Political will, and all of those good things, which is just, I think, going to take time. But I think it's better than it was, but there's an awful long way to go. Yeah. Please.
As a casual observer, you seem that the maybe of a Gulf War that the UN has had a lower profile. Is that the sense from the organization?
That's interesting. I mean, I don't know. Depending on the topic, that could be a good thing or a bad thing. Think about two different worlds, though, for a minute. Because on one hand, there's the whole peace and security side of things. Right? And that's where the headlines come from, to some degree. And there, of course, I mean, the UN, in different ways, has been very much involved with the sort of the crises of the day. everything from the Ukraine to Syria to northern Iraq and beyond. But one must always remember that the UN's actions are simply, that's really the forum where the international community is acting. So if we ever get to the point of, well, the UN isn't doing this or is doing that, it's really about the international community is unable to do this or is doing badly that or whatever it is. So in some ways, the UN is the stage on which particularly the interstate rivalries that we see playing out in Syria, for example, happen. And they happen in the Security Council, and there's a quarterly meeting which goes on all day and sometimes into the night on Middle East issues, which is wonderful to read the transcripts of, because it's the nearest we get back to the days of sort of banging shoes on desks and things like that. It's amazing quite how rude these people are willing to be to one another in public. But if we move away from the peace and security side, even the last year has been extraordinarily successful from the UN from the point of multilateral negotiations. So the climate change agreement in Paris, going into it, it was really touch and go whether an agreement of any sort would come out on something that's staring in the face and is going to change the lives of all our grandchildren. The Sustainable Development Goals is another. We have coming up in a couple of weeks the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul, and we're in the midst of a massive humanitarian crisis. There are more displaced people in the world now than there were at the end of the Second World War. Right? So there are a number of these things, and in some ways on those, the less headline-y stuff, in some ways, the UN has actually been recently spectacularly successful, rather to its own surprise, I must say. So that's where, the other thing that is always odd to me, talking to an audience in the US, anywhere else in the world, generally, talk about the United Nations and peace will have a positive view, and what they read in the newspapers or anywhere else is positive. It's not the case in the United States, although it was so important. The United States in the early days of the United Nations made the UN what it was. I mean, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights just got under the wire before the Cold War settled in. It's actually funny because very shortly after that you had senators proclaiming that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written on pink paper, right? In other words, it was sort of communist and socialist inspired. And it's sort of been downhill ever since in some ways. But the reality is, of course, that the UN has always worked best when the US has been positively engaged. And as it has in the last couple of representatives of the US at the UN, and as we keep our fingers crossed as we come to some political changes coming up. Please. Mm-hmm. I was trying to find, there was a phrase where I got the closest to it, I think. And it was in this area of thinking about why people do things and how they do it. And in some ways, I think what we're talking about, yes, I talked about things that shape policymakers' inspiration, motivation, strategies, and methodologies. And so I'm being very unspecific, but I think very deliberately, because it's actually the reality of what's going on in people's heads that I'm trying to connect with, right? And whatever that is to them, I want to connect to it. So it isn't, which is not to say that, you know, there is no truth and everything is relative and all of these kinds of things. Although our approach to that and some of the things that Paul quoted on earlier on is that our approach to truth tends to be that we're going to get as close as we can, but actually we're probably never going to quite get there. You know, for the mathematicians among us, there's something sort of almost asymptotic about it. You can get really, really close, but you can never quite get there, perhaps. And it's actually a constant search for trying to make our definition of what is right, what is true, as close as we can get to it. But the reality of that is saying, though, perhaps primarily, that it's not about